You do not belong in a courtroom, sweetheart. Learn your place before someone has to teach it to you. The words echoed across the stone steps outside the Jefferson County Courthouse just after 9 o'clock on a bright Monday morning, loud enough for strangers to stop walking and turn their heads. Naomi Carter tightened her grip around the leather portfolio pressed against her side, refusing to let her hands shake even as every eye seemed to settle on her. She had spent years preparing for this day. Her navy suit had been carefully pressed the night before, her speech folded neatly inside the portfolio, and every mile she had traveled from the small apartment where she grew up to these courthouse steps represented sacrifices that no one standing there could possibly see. She was not arriving for a trial. She was there to attend the swearing-in ceremony celebrating the newest graduates who had successfully completed law school and passed the bar examination. The courthouse behind her represented everything she had believed in, since she was a little girl listening to her father explain that justice belonged to everyone, even when the world acted as though it did not. Before she could continue toward the entrance, a marked police cruiser rolled slowly toward the curb. 2 white police officers stepped out, laughing about something unrelated before one of them noticed Naomi standing alone near the courthouse stairs. Officer Daniel Brooks glanced at her polished shoes, the leather portfolio, and the courthouse entrance before exchanging a smirk with his partner. He walked toward her with the casual confidence of someone who had never questioned whether authority belonged to him. "Can I help you?" he asked, although the tone made it clear that he believed the opposite. Naomi answered politely, "I am here for an event inside the courthouse." Daniel looked her up and down with exaggerated skepticism before shaking his head. "Really? Because people usually dress up when they belong somewhere important." A few nearby pedestrians slowed down, sensing tension without fully understanding why. Naomi remained composed. "I believe I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Daniel chuckled and leaned slightly closer, making sure everyone nearby could hear him. "Maybe you should double-check that invitation before security wastes their time." His partner laughed loudly while another officer standing beside the cruiser folded his arms with an amused expression. Naomi felt dozens of silent eyes studying her, waiting to see whether she would argue, cry, or walk away. Instead, she simply stood there, breathing slowly, determined not to surrender her dignity to someone who had already decided who she was before hearing a single sentence about her life. At that moment, another officer casually brushed against the portfolio tucked beneath her arm. The folder slipped from her hands, scattering carefully organized ceremony papers across the courthouse steps. A sudden breeze carried several pages across the sidewalk. Daniel watched the papers tumble without making any effort to help. Instead, he smiled faintly and said, "Looks like the courthouse is trying to tell you something." A few uncomfortable witnesses lowered their eyes while one young woman instinctively reached down to collect the papers before Naomi quietly thanked her. Kneeling on the warm stone, Naomi gathered every page one by one with remarkable patience, smoothing each wrinkled sheet before placing it carefully back into the folder. She never raised her voice. She never argued. She never insulted the officers standing above her. As she slowly rose to her feet, she looked directly at Daniel with calm eyes that carried neither fear nor hatred. "One day," she said softly, "the law will remind all of us that respect is not something a badge can demand. It is something character must earn." Without waiting for a reply, Naomi turned toward the courthouse entrance and continued climbing the broad stone staircase beneath the morning sun, unaware that several people had quietly recorded every second of what had just happened. Naomi Carter stepped through the courthouse doors without looking back, even though she could still hear faint laughter echoing from outside. The polished marble floor reflected the morning sunlight pouring through the tall windows, creating long ribbons of light that stretched across the grand entrance hall. She paused only long enough to straighten the slightly bent pages inside her leather portfolio before taking a slow, steady breath. No one inside the courthouse knew what had happened only moments earlier, and she quietly decided that she would not allow a stranger's cruelty to define one of the most important days of her life. The receptionist smiled warmly, verified her invitation, and directed her toward the ceremonial courtroom on the second floor where dozens of new attorneys, family members, professors, and community leaders had already begun gathering. As Naomi entered the room, the atmosphere changed from the tension outside to one filled with hope and accomplishment. Proud parents adjusted cameras, friends embraced one another, and graduates exchanged nervous smiles while carefully arranging their robes and certificates. Naomi greeted several classmates who had studied beside her through countless late nights in the law library. None of them noticed the faint marks left on the edge of her portfolio or the small crease running across the speech she had planned to deliver after the ceremony. She quietly slipped into her assigned seat and looked toward the judge's bench, where the state flag and the American flag stood side by side beneath the seal of justice. As the ceremony began, distinguished judges spoke about fairness, responsibility, and the sacred duty of protecting the Constitution without fear or favor. Every sentence reminded Naomi why she had chosen this profession years earlier after watching ordinary families struggle to find equal treatment under the law. She remembered evenings when her father returned home exhausted from work, but still insisted that education was something no one could take away. She remembered her mother encouraging her to answer prejudice with excellence instead of anger. Those lessons had carried her through every difficult exam, every scholarship application, and every moment someone underestimated her because of the color of her skin. When the graduates stood one by one to take their oath, Naomi repeated every word with quiet conviction, promising to uphold the law with integrity and impartiality. Her voice remained steady despite everything that had happened outside. After the ceremony concluded, many families gathered for photographs beneath the courthouse columns, while local reporters interviewed several of the newly admitted attorneys. Naomi chose a quieter corner overlooking the courthouse lawn and carefully unfolded the speech she had intended to give at a community celebration later that afternoon. She noticed faint water stains from where the papers had scattered across the stone steps, but every sentence remained readable. Rather than rewriting the pages, she gently smoothed them with her hand and smiled to herself. Across the street, Officer Daniel Brooks had already forgotten the woman he had mocked. He laughed with fellow officers while finishing paperwork inside his patrol vehicle, convinced the encounter had been meaningless. What he did not realize was that several witnesses had uploaded short videos recorded on their phones before leaving for work, each clip capturing a slightly different angle of the incident outside the courthouse. None of those videos had attracted much attention yet, but they had quietly begun spreading across local social media pages, as people questioned why a woman carrying legal documents had been treated with such disrespect outside the very building meant to represent equal justice. Naomi remained completely unaware that cameras had recorded the encounter. She simply walked down the courthouse steps once more beneath the bright afternoon sky, carrying the same leather portfolio a little more carefully than before, determined that her future would be shaped by the law she had sworn to uphold rather than by the humiliation someone else had chosen to create. By early evening, the short videos recorded outside the courthouse had quietly traveled far beyond the small circle of people who had witnessed the encounter in person. One clip showed Naomi Carter calmly gathering the papers scattered across the courthouse steps, while several officers stood watching without offering assistance. Another captured Officer Daniel Brooks smiling after questioning whether she belonged inside the building. A third video included Naomi's calm reply about respect and character, before she disappeared through the courthouse doors without another word. None of the recordings contained dramatic music or sensational editing. They did not need to. Their power came from the ordinary truth visible in every frame. Thousands of people recognized something painfully familiar in the quiet humiliation of a woman who refused to surrender her dignity. Local residents began sharing the videos across neighborhood pages, community groups, and legal organizations, asking how such treatment could happen outside a courthouse dedicated to equal justice. Comments multiplied throughout the evening, not fueled by outrage alone, but by disappointment that an institution built to protect fairness had become the setting for public disrespect. Several attorneys who had attended the swearing-in ceremony recognized Naomi from the videos and quietly expressed support without seeking attention for themselves. Community leaders called for professionalism rather than anger, reminding everyone that accountability strengthened public trust instead of weakening it. While conversations continued online, Naomi spent the evening at a small community center delivering the speech she had prepared long before that difficult morning. Standing before students dreaming of careers in law, public service, and education, she never mentioned what had happened outside the courthouse. Instead, she spoke about perseverance, discipline, and the responsibility that came with knowledge. She encouraged every young person in the room to believe that justice was strongest when guided by integrity instead of emotion. Her words carried unusual weight, because they reflected the way she had already chosen to live. When the event ended, parents thanked her, students asked thoughtful questions, and volunteers folded chairs as the last rays of sunlight faded beyond the windows. Naomi returned home believing the day had finally come to an end, completely unaware that millions of people had already begun discussing the encounter she had chosen not to talk about. Across town, Officer Daniel Brooks finished his shift with the same confidence he carried every day. Inside the precinct break room, he laughed with several fellow officers, joking about routine calls and weekend plans while never once thinking about the woman outside the courthouse. To him, the encounter had lasted only a few minutes before disappearing into another ordinary workday. As he walked toward the parking lot, one younger officer glanced down at his phone before looking up with visible hesitation. "Daniel," he said quietly, "have you seen what people are posting tonight?" Daniel shrugged with little interest and accepted the phone. His relaxed expression slowly disappeared as he recognized his own face on the screen. The video continued playing in complete silence except for the sound of wind carrying pages across the courthouse steps. There were no dramatic edits, no misleading captions, and no missing context. Only his own words, his own smile, and Naomi quietly collecting her papers beneath the eyes of strangers. For the first time since that morning, Daniel watched himself from someone else's perspective. The parking lot suddenly felt much quieter than before as the evening breeze moved gently through the trees surrounding the precinct, carrying with it a silence that seemed heavier than any accusation could have been. The following morning the story dominated local conversations, yet Naomi Carter chose not to answer a single interview request. Reporters waited outside the legal aid office where she had recently accepted a junior position, hoping for a statement that would keep the headlines alive for another news cycle. She quietly thanked them for their professionalism, declined every microphone, and walked inside with the same calm expression she had carried through the courthouse doors the day before. Her supervisor noticed the growing attention and gently asked whether she wanted time away from the office until the public interest faded. Naomi smiled politely and shook her head. "People still need legal help today," she answered. "Their problems did not stop because mine became visible." Those simple words quickly became the only public comment anyone could attribute to her. While social media continued debating the conduct of the officers, Naomi spent her days helping families complete housing paperwork, assisting elderly veterans with benefit appeals, and preparing legal research for attorneys who often worked long hours representing clients who could not afford expensive law firms. She arrived before sunrise, left after sunset, and treated every visitor with the same patience she wished had been shown to her. As weeks turned into months, the attention surrounding the courthouse incident slowly disappeared beneath newer headlines. Television crews moved on. Online discussions faded. The videos remained available, but the internet found something else to talk about. Naomi never tried to revive the story because she had never wanted public sympathy. She wanted a career built upon discipline instead of publicity. Year after year she continued studying every evening, accepting increasingly difficult cases, earning the respect of judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys who recognized her remarkable preparation and unwavering professionalism. Senior lawyers trusted her judgment because she listened more than she spoke. Clients trusted her because she never made promises she could not keep. Even opposing counsel respected the quiet confidence she brought into every courtroom. Promotions followed not because anyone felt sorry for her, but because excellence became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Brooks continued advancing through the police department. The criticism surrounding the courthouse video gradually faded from official conversations, and life returned to what felt like normal. He received favorable evaluations, trained younger officers, and developed a reputation for confidence under pressure. Yet every so often, usually during quiet moments after long shifts, he remembered the woman who had calmly gathered her papers instead of arguing with him. He never admitted those memories to anyone. Instead, he convinced himself that the entire incident had been exaggerated by people who had only watched a few seconds of video, without understanding the full situation. That explanation became easier to repeat with every passing year, until he almost believed it himself. Time continued moving with quiet determination. 7 years passed almost unnoticed. Seasons changed. Elections came and went. New officers joined the department while experienced judges retired from the bench. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel walked into the precinct briefing room where several detectives were discussing a major federal investigation involving allegations that would soon attract national attention. The room felt unusually quiet as supervisors distributed official notices explaining that multiple officers, including Daniel, would be required to appear in federal court as proceedings moved forward. No one yet knew which judge would preside over the case. Daniel accepted the envelope without visible concern, believing it would be another difficult legal process managed by another unfamiliar face in a black judicial robe. Outside the station, golden leaves drifted slowly across the parking lot beneath a clear blue sky, while hundreds of miles away, inside a stately federal courthouse, a newly appointed judge reviewed the first pages of a case file that carried names she had not seen in nearly 7 years. The federal courthouse carried a different kind of silence than the county building where Naomi Carter had once climbed the steps with a leather portfolio pressed against her side. This silence felt heavier, shaped by years of precedent, responsibility, and decisions that reached far beyond the walls of a single courtroom. Early that morning, attorneys carrying thick case files crossed polished marble floors while court staff prepared exhibits and organized witness schedules with practiced precision. Reporters gathered outside behind designated barriers, speaking quietly into cameras about one of the most closely watched public integrity cases in recent years. The investigation had uncovered allegations that several officers had repeatedly failed to follow required procedures, submitted inaccurate official reports, and abused the public trust entrusted to them by the communities they had sworn to protect. No dramatic accusations echoed through the courthouse hallways. Instead, every conversation centered on documents, evidence, testimony, and the slow, deliberate process that defined the American justice system. Officer Daniel Brooks arrived wearing a dark business suit instead of his police uniform. The familiar confidence that had followed him through years of service seemed noticeably restrained as he passed through courthouse security with the other defendants. Their attorneys reviewed schedules, reminded everyone to remain professional, and emphasized that every statement made inside the courtroom would matter. Daniel nodded politely, but his attention wandered toward the high wooden doors leading into the courtroom. He had appeared in court before as a witness during previous cases, yet this morning felt entirely different. For the first time in his career, he was entering not as someone representing the authority of the law, but as someone expected to answer difficult questions under its authority. Even so, he reassured himself that the presiding judge would simply be another experienced federal jurist who knew nothing about his past beyond the official case file. Inside the courtroom, spectators gradually filled the gallery. Journalists arranged notebooks, legal observers quietly discussed constitutional issues, and family members sat together speaking in hushed voices filled with uncertainty and hope. The American flag stood motionless beside the bench, illuminated by soft morning light pouring through tall windows that overlooked the city skyline. Every detail reflected stability, reminding everyone present that institutions endured far longer than individual careers. Court staff organized exhibits with quiet precision while the courtroom deputy confirmed attendance and prepared the official record. Daniel glanced across the room, recognizing prosecutors, defense counsel, and investigators, but the judge's chair remained empty. He checked his watch, believing proceedings would begin within minutes. A clerk entered carrying several folders before speaking briefly with the courtroom deputy, who nodded respectfully. Moments later, the courtroom doors behind the bench opened. "All rise," the courtroom deputy announced in a clear, steady voice. Every person inside the courtroom immediately stood. Daniel adjusted his jacket and looked toward the entrance with little curiosity, expecting another unfamiliar face wearing the traditional black robe of the federal judiciary. Instead, time seemed to slow into complete stillness. Walking with calm confidence toward the bench was Judge Naomi Carter. Her posture reflected quiet authority earned through years of discipline rather than demanded through position alone. She neither hurried nor hesitated. Her expression remained composed, professional, and completely impartial as she acknowledged the courtroom before taking her seat beneath the seal of the United States. Daniel felt the color leave his face almost instantly. 7 years disappeared in a single heartbeat. The courthouse steps, the scattered papers, the careless smile, and the quiet words about respect returned with astonishing clarity. Naomi never looked at him with anger. She simply opened the case file before her, adjusted her reading glasses, and prepared to begin the proceedings exactly as the law required. The courtroom remained completely still after Judge Naomi Carter took her seat, as though even the quiet hum of the ventilation system had faded beneath the weight of the moment. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows behind the gallery, casting long bands of golden light across polished wooden benches and the seal mounted high above the bench. Naomi adjusted the stack of neatly organized case files before her with measured precision, then looked across the courtroom with the same calm attention she gave every person who appeared before her. Her eyes briefly passed over Officer Daniel Brooks without lingering for even a second longer than professional courtesy required. There was no trace of recognition in her expression, no hint of satisfaction, and certainly no desire to revisit the past. To every observer inside the courtroom, she appeared exactly as a federal judge should appear, composed, impartial, and fully devoted to the law rather than personal history. Daniel, however, could not steady his thoughts. Every word spoken by the courtroom deputy seemed distant, almost muffled beneath the flood of memories returning with startling clarity. He remembered the bright morning outside the county courthouse, the leather portfolio falling onto the stone steps, the scattered papers dancing in the wind, and the quiet dignity of the woman he had dismissed without reason. For years he had convinced himself that the incident had been insignificant, one uncomfortable moment exaggerated by strangers on the internet. Yet seeing Naomi seated beneath the seal of justice forced him to confront a truth he had avoided for 7 years. The encounter had not disappeared simply because he had chosen to forget it. It had become part of another person's journey, while remaining an unfinished lesson in his own. The clerk called the case to order, and the proceedings began with routine matters involving scheduling, evidentiary standards, and procedural motions. Naomi listened attentively to each attorney before asking thoughtful questions in a steady, respectful voice. She interrupted no one unnecessarily and treated prosecutors and defense counsel with identical courtesy. Every ruling she issued referenced established legal principles rather than personal opinion, reinforcing the quiet confidence that filled the courtroom. Daniel found himself watching her with growing disbelief. She could have allowed bitterness to influence her tone, even in subtle ways no one else might notice, yet there was nothing except fairness. The woman he had once judged in a matter of seconds was now demonstrating a level of discipline he had never expected to witness. During a brief recess, Daniel remained seated while attorneys quietly discussed documents near counsel tables. Through the courtroom windows he noticed autumn leaves drifting slowly across the courthouse plaza, moving gently with each passing breeze before settling on the granite walkways below. The peaceful scene contrasted sharply with the unrest inside his own mind. For the first time in many years, he stopped thinking about protecting his reputation and began thinking about the countless moments when simple respect could have changed another person's day. Across the courtroom, Naomi reviewed the next section of the case file in complete silence, her pen moving deliberately across the margins as she made careful notes. She did not glance toward Daniel, nor did she acknowledge the shared history known only to them. In that quiet distance between the bench and the defense table, Daniel finally understood something that had escaped him for years. Authority could command obedience, but only character could earn genuine respect. And on this morning, beneath the steady light filling the federal courtroom, the greatest judgment he faced was no longer written inside the case file resting before the judge. It was unfolding silently within his own conscience. The trial unfolded over several weeks with the quiet discipline that defines the American justice system at its best. Every morning the courtroom filled before the scheduled start time as attorneys organized exhibits, witnesses waited patiently outside the courtroom doors, and members of the public settled into the gallery hoping to understand how the evidence would shape the outcome. Judge Naomi Carter maintained the same measured routine each day. She entered the courtroom without unnecessary ceremony, greeted counsel with professional courtesy, and reminded everyone that every participant deserved fairness, regardless of the allegations before the court. She listened carefully to each witness, reviewed every document presented by both sides, and ruled on objections with calm explanations grounded entirely in the law. There was never a raised voice from the bench, never an impatient remark, and never a moment that suggested personal feelings had found their way into the courtroom. Legal analysts attending the proceedings quietly remarked on her extraordinary restraint, noting that she treated every attorney with equal respect, while insisting that every argument be supported by credible evidence rather than emotion. Daniel Brooks watched this pattern repeat day after day until it became impossible for him to ignore what stood directly before him. The woman he had dismissed in a matter of seconds years earlier had become the very definition of judicial integrity. As testimony continued, several witnesses described decisions that had damaged public confidence in law enforcement, while official records and documented communications were examined carefully under established legal standards. Naomi never allowed assumptions to replace facts, reminding everyone that conclusions belong to evidence alone. More than once she ruled in favor of motions submitted by the defense when the law required it, even though doing so temporarily strengthened Daniel's position. Each ruling surprised him more than the last because he realized she was protecting the fairness of the process rather than seeking an easier path toward any particular outcome. During one afternoon recess, Daniel remained alone in the nearly empty courtroom after most people had stepped into the hallway. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating tiny particles of dust drifting almost weightlessly through the still air. He looked toward the judge's bench, now empty for only a few minutes, and remembered another beam of morning sunlight falling across scattered papers on courthouse steps 7 years earlier. Until that moment he had always remembered himself as a police officer carrying authority. Now he remembered himself simply as a man who had failed to show another human being the basic respect every person deserved. The realization settled over him with quiet certainty instead of dramatic shock. It was not the evidence against him that weighed most heavily on his heart. It was the understanding that Naomi had carried the burden of that encounter without allowing it to harden her character, while he had carried the memory only by convincing himself it no longer mattered. When court resumed that afternoon, Naomi entered with the same composed expression she had worn every day. She thanked the witnesses for their time, acknowledged the professionalism of both legal teams, and continued guiding the proceedings with unwavering impartiality. Daniel listened to every word with new understanding. He finally recognized that true strength was never displayed through public humiliation, loud authority, or the ability to make another person feel small. True strength sat quietly behind the bench, allowing justice to speak through patience, discipline, and unwavering fairness. For the first time since putting on a police badge many years earlier, Daniel understood that the greatest measure of character was not how much power someone possessed, but how faithfully they honored the dignity of those standing before them. The final day of testimony ended without celebration or dramatic confrontation. When the attorneys presented their closing arguments, the courtroom remained as disciplined as it had been from the beginning, every statement measured against the evidence that had been carefully examined over weeks of proceedings. Judge Naomi Carter thanked both legal teams for their professionalism before announcing that the court would issue its ruling, according to the law after completing its review of the full record. No one inside the courtroom could read her thoughts. Her expression remained steady, revealing nothing beyond the quiet responsibility carried by every judge entrusted with decisions that could affect many lives. Several days later the courtroom filled once again. Reporters occupied nearly every available seat in the press section, while members of the public waited in respectful silence. Daniel Brooks sat beside his attorney, his hands resting motionless on the counsel table as he listened to the courtroom deputy call the session to order. Naomi entered with the same calm dignity she had demonstrated throughout the proceedings. After reviewing the findings supported by the evidence, she delivered the court's ruling in a clear and even voice. Every conclusion referred to documented facts, sworn testimony, and established legal standards. There was not a single unnecessary remark, no emotional language, and no indication that personal history had influenced a single sentence. When she finished reading the decision, the courtroom remained silent for several long moments before people slowly began gathering their files. Daniel lowered his eyes, understanding that the law had spoken exactly as it was designed to speak, through evidence rather than emotion. As the gallery gradually emptied, he remained seated until his attorney quietly placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder before stepping outside to speak with reporters. Daniel waited several minutes before walking alone into the nearly empty courthouse hallway. The afternoon sunlight streamed through towering windows, filling the marble corridor with a warm glow that softened every shadow stretching across the polished floor. At the far end of the hallway, he noticed Naomi leaving a conference room with a stack of case files held neatly against her arm. She was no longer wearing the expression of a presiding judge addressing a courtroom. Instead, She simply looked like a dedicated public servant, preparing for the next responsibility waiting on her calendar. Daniel hesitated before walking toward her. For a brief moment he considered turning away, but he realized that avoiding this conversation would only repeat the same failure that had followed him for 7 years. When he finally reached her, Naomi stopped politely and waited without impatience. Daniel took a slow breath before speaking. "Judge Carter," he said quietly, "I do not expect forgiveness, and I certainly do not expect you to forget what happened years ago. I only wanted to tell you that I finally understand the harm caused by the way I treated you. I judged you before I knew anything about you, and I carried that mistake far longer than I should have. I am deeply sorry." Naomi looked at him with the same calm eyes that had once met his on the courthouse steps years earlier. There was no triumph in her expression and no desire to prolong his discomfort. After a thoughtful pause, she answered gently, "Mr. Brooks, forgiveness and accountability are not enemies. The court addressed accountability because that is its duty. What you choose to do with the lessons that follow is now yours alone." Daniel nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle more deeply than any public criticism ever had. As Naomi continued down the quiet hallway toward another courtroom where another case already awaited her attention, Daniel remained standing beneath the afternoon light, realizing that the greatest act of grace he had ever witnessed had come from the very person he had once believed did not belong inside a courthouse. Several months passed, and the federal courthouse returned to its familiar rhythm. New cases replaced old headlines, reporters pursued different stories, and the nation continued moving forward as it always had. The trial that had once filled every seat in the courtroom slowly became another chapter in the public record, preserved inside neatly organized files resting on quiet shelves where history waited without demanding attention. For Judge Naomi Carter, life changed very little. Each morning she walked through the same courthouse entrance before sunrise, greeted courthouse staff by name, reviewed the day's docket with careful attention, and stepped onto the bench carrying the same promise she had made years earlier when she first raised her right hand and swore to uphold the Constitution. Every person who entered her courtroom received the same opportunity to be heard, regardless of appearance, profession, or personal history. Attorneys admired her consistency. Court employees appreciated her kindness. Young law clerks quickly learned that integrity was demonstrated through countless small decisions, rather than a few dramatic moments. One crisp autumn afternoon, after concluding another full day of hearings, Naomi gathered her case files and quietly left the courtroom as the golden light of the setting sun stretched across the marble floors. Outside the courthouse, a group of law students waited for a scheduled educational tour. Among them stood a young black woman holding a notebook tightly against her chest, her eyes filled with the same mixture of determination and uncertainty Naomi had once carried herself. When the students recognized the judge, they politely thanked her for her service before preparing to leave with their professor. The young woman hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "Your Honor," she said softly, "sometimes it feels like people decide who you are before you ever have a chance to speak. How do you keep believing in justice when that happens?" Naomi smiled gently, remembering another courthouse, another staircase, and another morning carried by the wind. She answered with quiet sincerity, "Justice does not begin when someone believes in you. It begins when you refuse to stop believing in what is right." The student nodded, her expression growing steadier as she thanked the judge before joining the rest of her class. Naomi watched them disappear down the courthouse steps, hopeful that the next generation would inherit institutions made stronger by people willing to choose character over pride. Across town, Daniel Brooks had begun rebuilding his own life in quieter ways. No longer defined by authority or public recognition, he devoted his time to community programs that encouraged respectful relationships between public servants and the neighborhoods they served. He spoke honestly about the importance of treating every person with dignity, admitting that true professionalism began long before difficult decisions ever reached a courtroom. He never told those stories to erase his past. He shared them so others would not repeat it. On one peaceful evening, as the courthouse lights gradually illuminated against the darkening sky, Naomi paused for a brief moment at the top of the stone steps before walking toward her car. A gentle breeze moved through the trees lining the courthouse lawn, carrying fallen leaves across the familiar walkway. Years earlier, those same steps had witnessed quiet humiliation. Now they reflected something entirely different. Not revenge. Not triumph. Simply the enduring strength of integrity. Naomi took one final look at the courthouse standing proudly beneath the fading light before continuing forward with calm purpose. Behind her, the building remained exactly where it had always been, silent, steady, and waiting for another day to remind the world that while prejudice may speak first, justice has the final word.